بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. Sorry, I have to mute this. Okay. Bismillah. Sorry for that interruption. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah of Imam Shurunbulali, we've reached the wajib actions of the prayer. And the wajib actions of the prayer, of course, give us one of the dimensions of fiqh that is distinct between the Hanafis and the others, and the other madhahib. And one of the aspects of this arises from how we understand, how the Hanafis, how do the great Hanafi Imams understand the nature of language. Why? Because the principles of interpretation take what is the divine address and the address of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how is it understood in terms of what it indicates of meanings related to our actions. And in short, the realization of the is that the texts that indicate responsibility are those whose indication is decisive in indication and which are decisively established. So those establish the fard, and those whose either indication or whose transmission is non-decisive, is dhanni, and the most that they can affirm is the wajib. And it also is understood that the obligatory actions relate to the presence of the reality of a matter. يعني بحيث لو لم يأتي به كأنه لم يأتي بالمأمور. Right? That the obligatory matters, and the obligatory, of course, we mentioned the obligatory can be a rukn, or it can be a shart, or an obligatory matter that is not dakhil fil mahiyya, right? Right? And there's like the order between the integrals, etc. Right? But it is obligatory. And you can see examples of that in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, right? When it says the conditions and the integrals. And Imam Shurunbulali is actually quite careful in how he discusses the topic, right? Because at that time this issue had been opened up. So he navigates quite carefully. Okay. The wajib, if omitted, the action is done because you fulfill the command that is clearly established. The wajib relates to the key details. Without it, the action is deficient. Right? Right? So we've taken earlier, like when we looked at the beginning of Kitab al-Tahara, we looked at the distinction of what establishes the fard, etc. And there's a nice discussion there between the fard and the wajib, right? And there's also the nuance that of the wajib there is that which is of the higher of the, so something that may be established by a wajib level text, which is a non-decisive text, but because of sufficient strengthening elements, the mujtahid deemed it akin to the fard. And what is that called? Al-fardu al-amali. This is ala نوعي الواجب. It is واجب ثبوتا فرض عملا. وهو ما يفوت الجواز بفواته. Right? Is that which, if omitted, the action is not valid. And there's a few things, and we've touched upon some of them previously, about, related to that. And there's a nice discussion in Tahtawi that al-adilla as-sam'iyya, he divides, that, because there's two considerations, right? That the transmitted proofs, that the proofs have a transmission and an indication, a thubut and a dilala. The thubut, how are they established? They're established by transmission. All the Quran is qat'iyya thubut. The Sunnah is qat'iyya thubut, which is the mutawatir, and that which is akin to the mutawatir. And dhanniyya thubut, wa huwa ma ada dhalik. It is other than that. And then there's dilala, indication. There's the dilala al-qat'iyya, that which لا يحتمل لا يحتمل إلا معنى واحد, and decisive indication can only indicate one meaning, and ظني الدلالة يحتمل أكثر من معنى لكن ترجح معنى على غيره, right? Right? And there's a right? And here Tahtawi quotes from Imam Ashrunbulali himself, min al-Sharh, but with some nuances added, right? And Ashrunbulali quotes this from Al-Kashf. What is Al-Kashf? Right? Al-Kashf is Kashf al-Asrar. Right? Ala Usul al-Bazdawi. Right? It's one of the clearest of the large works in Hanafi Usul. Right? But that's way beyond our scope. If you want to read a little further than what's in Tahtawi, you could look in Imdad al-Fattah. Okay. And in many ways, the distinction between the fard and the wajib and the omission is like in contracts. You have the consequence that between the batil and the fasid, right? That if you omit the fard, your action is batil, is invalid. It's like the contract, it didn't happen. If the wajib relates to the key awsaf of the action, if omitted, the action has fasad. It is corrupt. It has a fundamental deficiency. It's valid, but has a fundamental deficiency. You have to address that fundamental deficiency. And here the discussion in Hashid ibn Abdin, he quotes actually Al-Hamawi in his Sharh on the Kanz. And the Hamawi's Sharh on the Kanz is deeply is one of the sources of Abu Saud in his Fathullah al-Mu'in. Right? Which is, and here, Fathullah al-Mu'in, I don't know if I have volume 1 here, but it's very, very nice. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Okay. So the wajib. الواجب قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمة الله تعالى عليه الواجب في اللغة يجيء بمعنى اللزوم وبمعنى السقوط. Right? الواجب, there's a little critique here. الواجب, wujub is like luzum and suqut. So Tahtawi says wajib would be like lazim and saqit. Right? Or you say wujub would be like luzum or suqut. Right? Just for consistency. It would be ansab. So the necessary in the Arabic language has a range of meanings. Right? So it comes with the meaning of that which is required, lazim. And also, wajib is suqut, that which lifts what was required, that which drops your responsibility. وَبِمَعْنَى الْإِضْطِرَابِ, also that which is uncertain. Right? الْمَعْنَى الْمُلَازِم here is what's this? وجبت جنوبها. فإذا وجبت جنوبها. Right? أي سقطت. Right? So again, this meaning of wajib in the Arabic language this doesn't tell you the whole picture necessarily. Right? Now, in terms of usage in the Arabic language, we also have to keep in mind wajib is used for that which is required, and by required the secondary would be that it is so in that sense, wajib is like the fard. Right? But the shade of meaning that differs between the fard and the wajib, right, is that wajib itself, the word wajib itself is dhanniyu dilala. Why? Because fard bima'na al-qata', and the meaning fard, right? You say yuftarad alayk khalas, it means you must do it and cannot not do it. Right? But in Arabic, even in modern Arabic usage, someone says yajib an tazurana. Does it mean that you'll be sinful if you don't? No. Right? So wajib in Arabic usage has practically two meanings. Right? One is al-luzum, that which is required, such that if you don't do it, in that sense, it'll be like the fard. So that's why the Shafi'is and others deemed it synonymous to the fard. But it has in classical Arabic the usage of that which needs to be done, but dun al-qata'. Why? And there's many examples from the hadith of the Prophet. There's multiple examples of the hadith of the Prophet. Most famous of them, غسل الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. Right? Right? غسل الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. Right? Right? And it's used for الحث المؤكد, that which is encouraged with emphasis. Right? Right? واجب على كل محتلم. Right? غسل الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. Right? Is used there for what? الحث المؤكد. Something that is, the غسل of Jum'ah is واجب. أي يعني مؤكد. So it's هذا اللزوم not اللزوم بحيث لو ترك أثم but أو لا يصح, but الحث المؤكد. And the fuqaha use this even several centuries into into Islamic scholarship. You can see, for example, the author of the Bada'i', for example, right? Using this for multiple things, which are sunnah mu'akkada, but he'll say yajib kada wa kada. Right? In this meaning of التأكيد يعني of the تأكيد. Right? Right? And right? Right? And you can, and this this hadith, for example, right? If you look at the shuruh, they explain this meaning. The hadith, of course, itself is in Bukhari and elsewhere, right? And Imam al-Munawi explains it. Right? That it's this is mubalagha, right? It's mubalagha, that you really have to, right? You really should, right? Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, right? Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So actually, almost none of the madhahib, right? Some said that it's mansukh, right? Some said it's mansukh, that it used to be wajib, then there was naskh. But the other is that this is wajib in this ma'na lughawi. Da'wa naskh is always, it's easy to make, but hard to establish, right? Practically. And right, because it's also the meaning of suqut, that ما تسقط به المسؤولية, right? So Al-Qadi Abu Bakr al-Arabi, for example, explains that يعني يحتمل أن يسقط سقوط الفرائض ويحتمل أن يسقط سقوط السنن, right? Right? And right, Right? And interesting, Qadi Abu Bakr in Arabi quotes, right, from he has a sanad. قال شيخنا الفهري قال لنا قاضي القضاة الدامغاني قال لنا أبو الحسين القدوري رئيس الحنفية في وقته قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم غسل الجمعة واجب على كل محترم يعني ساقطا. Okay? That is something that, right, it's a duty that must be, lifted. يسقط سقوط الفرائض أو يحتمل يسقط سقوط السنن. Right? So it doesn't establish that it is fard. Right? Anyways, so the point here is that wajib has these two usages, right? The two usages being that which is required or that which is emphasized. So the fuqaha used it terminologically then to refer to what? They use it terminologically to refer to that which is required but fihi shubha. But they used it, but they terminologically contain the meaning, right? 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 So, وفي الشرع الواجب اسم لما لزمنا بدليل فيه شبهة is that which is required of us with a proof in which there is a shubha. Right? Now, this is not a definition that you can present generally. You say, oh, there's a shubha. Because shubha is a terminological use. Shubha, it doesn't mean a doubt. Something is established by an evidence in which there's doubt. You're like, what is meant by a shubha? Right? It's not a shubha that it's uncertain. By uncertain, is that which is shubha right? So there's ما يفيد القطع, that which is decisive. The shubha is that there is شبهة يورث جزما دون القطع. Right? يورث جزما, right, دون القطع, that causes us to be firm. So the wajib is not just like something, the proof has doubt in it. If there's doubt, then why are you saying you have to do it? No. Right? Shubha means that it is something established, right? And these definitions, they're made brief so that they can be remembered. But the definition, the definitions is like a placeholder, right? There's a whole, it's like an iceberg. This is the tip of the iceberg. It identifies, that's the one we're talking about. But most of the iceberg is underneath. Right? This one, لِمَا لَزِمَنَا. Right? So it is something that is required of us, with an evidence that is non-decisive. Right? So, right? And there are fuller definitions of the wajib than this. Right? There are fuller definitions of the wajib than this, right? So you can look at the wajib in a structural way in three ways. What the wajib affirms, how it is affirmed. الواجب ما So it's a حكم that is واجب ما يثبت به كيف يثبت. So what is affirmed by it? Number 2, كيف يثبت, how it is affirmed. And number 3 is, which is outside of the definition of course, الأثر حكمه يعني أثره المترتب عليه, ما يترتب عليه. Right? So what does it establish? It establishes luzum. Right? It's something that is required of you. How it is established? بدليل يفيد الجزم دون القطع لشبهة. Right? Right? So it's established by an evidence that is strong, that we affirm that it's required, but دون القطع. Right? That's the shubha. That we recognize that yes, it could affirm other than that. There's that the openness of the interpretive possibility causes us to lower our affirmation of it from decisiveness and all that. That is the shubha. Not shubha that is a doubt. اشتبهت علي القبلة. I don't have a shubha about the qibla, I don't know which way it is. So it's not shubhatun tufidu adam al-jazm. Because the shak is a shubha, it's taraddud. Right? So when you talk about a shubha, you have to realize, is it a shubha tufidu al-shak? Or tarfa'u al-jazm. Right? That you're inclined that way, but there's enough shubha that you don't affirm anything. But you're inclined in a way, but the shubha is an element of uncertainty, but موضع الشبهة is important. Right? موضع الشبهة is important. Because the shubha occurs right at the middle. I don't know which way to go. But it can occur before the dhann. Shubha fi the dhann, that you incline this way, but there's a shubha. So you don't affirm anything. That's the shubha there. But this is a shubha at the point of what? Of qata. That lawla shubha, were it not for this element of uncertainty, what would you affirm? Al-qata. Right? The decisive. With the shubha, and this is useful because it occurs on the other side of the scale too. Because there'll be a shubha fi nafi. Right? The makruh tahriman thabata bidalilin fihi shubha. But lawla tilka shubha, what would we have said? Haram. Similarly, it applies in ilm al-hadith. Right? The muhaddithin are very careful because the possibility of it being otherwise, what does al-Iraqi do in his takhrij of the Ihya? He said gharib, meaning I didn't find it. Why? Because when you say it's mawdu', khalas, you're making an absolute qata'at. But there's a shubha. I didn't check everywhere. So he says gharib. Others say lam ajidhu. Right? Okay, Bismillah. So this yurithu jazman duna al-qata'. Right? It causes us to affirm something decisively without affirm something firmly, but with an affirmation that's below decisiveness. That's how it's established. The third aspect is ما يترتب عليه, which we will see. What is the consequence of leaving the wajib? Right? Which we'll see. Right? Okay. قال فخر الإسلام. Who's فخر الإسلام? البزدوي. Right? Right? And please read his biography. His فخر الإسلام is one of the people نفتخر به. We make نفتخر بأئمتنا, but he's really, there's a reason he's called that. It's not just decorative. But it's also important because if you see فخر الإسلام, then why is Maulana الطحطاوي quoting from the Imdad from the Kashf, which is كشف الأسرار. We'll see, because كشف الأسرار is شرح في أصول مفهوم. Right? That's why that sort of, we identify it's not a puzzle, right? قال فخر الإسلام قدس الله سره وإنما سمي به، إنما سمي الواجب واجبا، إنما سمي الواجب به بالواجب، the واجب، إما لكونه ساقطا عنا علما, either because its knowledge is lifted from us, right? That is it decisive or not, right? أو لكونه ساقطا علينا عملا, or because it falls upon us to do it. ساقط عنا or علينا, right? Right? أو لكونه مضطربا, or it's uncertain, يعني بين الفرض والسنة, between the fard and the sunnah. أو بين اللزوم وعدمه, or between being required and not required. So that there's that element of uncertainty about it, right? فإنه يلزمنا عملا لا علمنا, because it's required upon us to act upon it, but it's not required upon us to believe in it, meaning that if, but what does mean لا يلزمنا بحيث لو لم نعتقده لا نكفر, لكن تركه فسق. ترك اعتقاده فسق. Right? See, and it's discussed in the Hashi and elsewhere. Okay. Allah. وشرعت. Now what's the حكمة التشريع? Right? This nuance. شرعت الواجبات لإكمال الفرائض. The wajibat have been legislated to complete the fard. Right? Right? لإكمال الفرائض. والسنن لإكمال الواجبات. And the sunnahs have been legislated to complete the wajib. والأدب لإكمال السنن. لإكمال السنة. This is بيان الحكمة. حكمة التشريع. This manifests, there's beautiful works on محاسن الشريعة. And the Hanafis talked a lot about that. They actually discuss it in the books of Usul as well. And some of the Hanafis wrote dedicated treatises on this subject as well, like al-Bukhari and others of the Hanafis. Because al-mashru' fihi sifatul husn. Right? And the hikmah of al-shari' is manifest in it. And also you see the rahmah in it, right? That it's gradual, right? It's gradual, but also it facilitates the path towards perfecting. Inna hadha ad-deena mateen. This religion is yusr. This religion is ease, said the Prophet ﷺ. But he also said, Inna hadha ad-deena mateen. This religion is deep. فَأَوْغِلُ فِيهِ بِرِفْقٍ. So enter in its depths gently. What is gentle entering into the depths of the deen? The fard. Then the wajib. then the sunnah, then the adab. And here, one of the other great encyclopedias of Islam, that don't get lost in it because there's all kinds of stuff there, right? But it's one of the great treasuries of Islam, is Hujjatullah al-Baligha of Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, Fakhr al-Hind, right? Right? People ask, if you could have one Indian scholar represent India, who would it be? And people would differ, but a lot of people would to Shah Waliullah. Some would say Imam Ahmad Sirhindi, Imam Rabbani. But was he really Indian? But what do you mean by really? Right? But Shah Waliullah. There's so much. Hind is. Some would say if you had someone represent India, you say Sayyidina Adam. But that's a separate matter. But Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi. But this aspect of what is the relationship between the fara'id and the sunnah and the hikmah of the tashri' of that, one of the greatest works in hikmah al-tashri'. Allah. And there's a modern edition from India. There's an Indian commentary on it, but in Urdu by Mufti Saeed Ahmed Palanpuri, called Rahmatullah al-Wasi'a, in Urdu. But there's an Arab edition of it with footnotes from the Sharh. That's very nice. There's also an edition with Shaykh Abdullah Darraz, I believe Lebanese scholar. He did one of the better Arab editions, Darraz. There's also the edition printed out of India in Arabic edition, because the Hujjatullah al-Baligha itself is in Arabic, but it takes from Mufti Palanpuri's commentary. Okay, Bismillah. So this is the wisdom of legislation, right? And you can see that Tahtawi gives examples like the tasbih. What does the tasbih do? So, for example, in ruku', the fard is mutlaq al-ruku'. The itmi'nan perfects the actual fard of ruku'. And the tasbih, which is sunnah, perfects the meaning of remaining motionless therein. And then the adab are mukammilat as-sunnah, right? Etc. ليكون كل منها حصنا لما شرع لتكميله. For each to serve as a protector of what it was legislated to complete. And there's other elements as well. ولجبر النقصان ولمضاعفة الأجر, right? ولتحقيق التقرب, right? And there's many other meanings, right? This is just the basic legal meaning. It protects, right? But also does ولي جلب النقصان, right? وحصول الثواب, right? وتحقيق التقرب. لا يزال عبدي يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه. And nafil, of course, has the meaning of ziyada. So nafil is also a relative concept. Something is nafil, respective of what's before it. Okay. وحكم الواجب استحقاق العقاب بتركه عمدا وعدم إكفار جاحده مع إثمه وفسقه والثواب بفعله. So the ruling of the wajib is being deserving of punishment for leaving it deliberately. And not deeming the one who denies it kafir, but it is fisq. Right? But it is fisq. وَالثَّوَابُ بِفِعْلِهِ, and the reward for acting upon it, this is its next worldly ruling. Its worldly ruling is سُقُوطُ الْمُطَالَبَةِ, is that what you're called upon to do is lifted from you. And that's why the wajib, it falls on you, has the meaning of suqut. It falls on you, and doing it drops it from your dues. Right? So in that sense, the wajib enters into your dhimma. Right? It's due upon you. The sunnah is like it latches on to your dues. Like if you have a vessel, right? The fard is in there, goes fully in there. The wajib is there, but it's near the top. Like there's ways it could drop without it, right? The sunnah sort of is attached to your dues, but it doesn't go into them, right? Like the sunnah is an opportunity. If you took it, you put it into your store of reward, right? But the sunnah was closer to the top of the vessel, so to speak. The other things are lower, but they also latch on to your dues as opportunities, right? You could have turned it and ching, have a return on the investment, or draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by it. So it was lost opportunity. But it wasn't in your dues in that sense. وَلُزُومُ السُّجُودِ السَّهْوِ لِنَقْصِ الصَّلَاةِ بِتَرْكِهِ سَهْوًا. And the wajib requires the forgetfulness prostrations due to the deficiency of the prayer if left forgetfully. وإعادتها, and you can read it وإعادتها or لزوم إعادتها بتركه عمدا, and it being required to repeat the prayer if the wajib was left deliberately. وسقوط الفرض ناقصا, and the fard is lifted from you but deficiently. إن لم يسجد ولم يعد, if one neither prostrated for it nor repeated it. Right? So here he sort of put a lot of things together, right? So what's the ruling of so there's aspects that it's deserving of punishment, right? Deserving of punishment, but less than the punishment of leaving the fard, right? As Imam Tahtawi mentions, right? The worldly its reward, this is the next worldly ruling. The worldly ruling is suqutul mutalaba. Now, if left, it requires forgetfulness prostrations. Right? Right? And okay, وسجود السهو لنقص الصلاة بتركه سهوا. Right? So what happens if the wajib is omitted? A wajib act of the prayer is omitted. This omission could be sahwan or amdan, forgetfully or deliberately. If omitted deliberately, you must repeat the prayer. Repeat the prayer, why? For omitting the wajib. But what suqutu i'adatu salah, right? But what's understood implicitly, but you have to say it here clearly, ni ba'da itmamiha, right? After completing it. So if you leave a wajib, you cannot leave the prayer, because ash-shuru'u mulzim, beginning the prayer is required. So this is an important point. If someone left a wajib, you cannot break your prayer. They left the wajib deliberately. And we're leaving aside the issue of the person of waswasa. So here, إعادتها بتركه عمدا, right? If you left deliberately, you must complete the prayer and repeat it. If the wajib is left behind the imam deliberately, that's something to think about. وسقوط الفرض, and so if left forgetfully, then within the prayer you must perform forgetfulness prostrations, right? And we look at the ahkam of sujood al-sahwi in their own place, but they say يجب سجود السهو لترك الواجب سهوا لا غير, right? Sujood al-sahwi is wajib. The forgetfulness prostration is necessary for leaving a necessary action forgetfully and nothing else. So doing the makruh tahriman, is there forgetfulness prostrations for it? No. Unless there is a, so is this of the things that have been deemed to be wajib? So you can't say, well, not omitting, not doing the makruh tahriman is wajib. No. The wajibat al-asliya lis-salah, the things that are in themselves wajib in the prayer, if those are omitted, so the sajdat al-sahw is min ahkam al-tark, right? Laysa min ahkam al-fi'l. So and that's one of the ways that helps distinguish what's wajib and what's forgetfulness prostration. That's what's doing makruh tahriman. Okay. But you've considered to have done your fard, but deficiently if you didn't perform forgetfulness prostrations, if left forgetfully, and not repeated. Repeating the prayer would be either if you left the wajib deliberately, or you left the wajib forgetfully but did not do forgetfulness prostrations. So Imam Shumbulali mentions this in the general sense. At-Tahtawi here does an important footnote, right? إعادتها بتركه عمدا. He says ما دام الوقت باقيا, right? So basically, and you can read the footnote, Maulana At-Tahtawi quotes, and this is also done by Sahib al-Durr al-Haskafi and a lot of the mutaakhirin, that Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, that if you perform a prayer in which you left the wajib, either deliberately or forgetfully but did not perform forgetfulness prostrations, then within the time it is wajib to repeat the prayer, right? And that's why you have to be very clear. Qada is لترك الفرض or فعل المبطل. Qada refers to عدم الأداء, right? If you did not perform the prayer. القضاء يكون لعدم الصلاة أو الإتيان به مع فوات ركن أو لفوات شرط أو عدم الإتيان بفرض, to include the rukn and the fard, right? And so the prayer has to be, you have to make up a prayer, either if you just didn't do it, or you did it without fulfilling a condition, or without doing the obligatory, which is either the integral or an obligatory action, right? With that nuance that the mutaakhirin gave. That's qada. I'ada is when you did it validly but deficiently. So, if you did, now, what is the hukum of the i'ada when called upon, Imam Tahtawi says إعادتها بتركه عمدا, right? أي ما دام الوقت باقيا, right? Within the time, so they said within the time, the حكم الإعادة is that it's الوجوب. بعد الوقت, it is, they said it's مستحب. Ibn Abdin has a major objection to this. And the objection is that there are two riwayat in the madhab. And this goes back to ikhtilaf in the takhrij of the aqwal of our imams regarding it. But basically there's a qawl that it's, the i'ada is wajibah. The repeating is necessary. And the other is that it's mustahab. So Ibn Abdin doesn't like the fact that they join between these two aqwal. So he says the tahqiq would be that given that the qawl bi wujub al-i'ada is the stronger takhrij of the mas'ala, the stronger interpretation of what the imams of the foundational imams of the madhab said. Therefore, khalas, that's the fatwa. And that is more precautionary. However, the problem with the wajib is that the nature of the wajib is that it'll be, if omitted, the person is likely to make that mistake repeatedly. So the methodological principle, so this is one of the places where what's in Hashid ibn Abdin is not necessarily the final word. And many of the ulama in Sham, for example, would not give fatwa on that position because if you apply it, it puts a lot of people in a lot of hardship. You know, someone makes mistakes in the Fatiha. Every ayah is wajib. You have to repeat all those prayers. Many people say, for example, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, what's it? Like they omit, right? They omit parts of the Fatiha, or they omit parts of the tashahhud, right? At-tahiyatu lillahi, assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabi. Like, they omit chunks of the Fatiha, etc., or the tashahhud, for example. So what happens? Do they have to? Is it wajib to repeat all those? Of course, if someone does that, that is more precautionary. And that's what's more legally rigorous. But the methodological principle is, and this is highlighted by Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi in his the principle, not this application of it, that there is no talfiq between aqwal within the madhab. That the imams of the madhab may take different narrations and put them together, right? Because these are all within the same methodological framework. But this is done by the imams of the school, not by any kid who comes and starts jumping up and down with their own theories. Right? And why did they do this? إذا ضاق الأمر اتسع الحكم. Because when matters become constrained, rulings may become more expansive. So, right? 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 So that's but if you failed to make it up within the time, it requires tawbah still, right? But then it will become recommended. So it's wajib, according to Tahtawi, Imam al-Tahtawi, and also al-Haskafi, and many others of the mutaakhirin. It's wajib to make up within the time, wajib to repeat within the time. The i'ada is wajib fil waqt, mustahabba kharijahu. But one would have to repent from that as well. According to Ibn Abdin, no. it's wajib fil waqt wa kharijahu. And you can see that. But we mentioned that, there are many, Allahu Alam, right? This qawl of the mutaakhirin. So Ibn Abdin was mentioned is the qiyas. That's a stronger narration, so khalas, but they عدلوا عنه تيسيرا. They left it تيسيرا. Allah. And those who would like to look for more about that, they can look. Allah. Now there's one other thing here, because this is misunderstood, right? That Tahtawi, for example, mentions after his footnote here, قوله إعادتها بتركه عمدا, he says ويندب إعادتها لترك السنة. It's recommended to repeat a prayer if you left the sunnah, right? The Mashaykh mention two things, right? That this is, and I heard this directly from Shaykh Hassan, right? That this is لغير الموسوس, someone who doesn't have waswasa, right? Number one. And secondly, وَلِمَنْ لَمْ يَعْتَدْ تَرْكَ مِثْلِهِ, or someone who doesn't normally leave the like of it, right? Right? لئلا يقع في كثرة إعادة الصلاة, because that's منهي عنه, right? Because that's وهو منهي عنه, right? And that's prohibited, right? لا يصلى, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يصلى بعد صلاة مثلها, right? One doesn't pray after a prayer the like of it. And I said تكرار على وجه الوسوسة, etc., right? So, and also if it doesn't lead to فوات ما هو أولى, right? So someone prays their fard and they did everything. So I left the tasbih. So what do? They repeat the prayer because they didn't do the tasbih once, but then because they did that, they don't end up doing the sunnah mu'akkada afterwards. Right? Right? Or they keep repeating this and they show up late for work. So that's not ala, So this is yundab nadban amman. This is a general recommendation. So one has, for the one who doesn't have waswasa, who does not normally leave these, and number two, it doesn't cause them to become of the people of waswasa, it doesn't lead to omitting what's more important than it, etc. And lest one fall under the Prophet's prohibition of repeating a prayer without reason. Okay. So this is the context we want to give to the wajib. And then he says, الأول وجوب قراءة الفاتحة. The first is the obligation of it being necessary to recite the Fatiha. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ بفاتحة الكتاب. There's no prayer for one who does not recite the Fatiha. Right? This la is nafiya. The manfi is implicit. Right? The la here, there's no prayer for one who does not recite the Fatiha of the book. It's related by Bukhari and Muslim. Right? This la is nafiya. The manfi, what is being negated, is implicit. And they say at-taqdir, so la budda min taqdir. One must determine what is implicit. والتقدير من باب الضرورة فيقدر الأقل وهو الكمال لا الصحة. Right? So تقدير, determining what is implicit, is a necessity. So necessity is limited to the extent of the necessity, so it is limited to the lesser of the possibilities. The possibilities are either there's no prayer that is complete or no prayer that is valid. Saying no prayer that is complete is a lesser affirmation vis-a-vis there's no prayer that is valid. So that's what is chosen. That's number one, in terms of the indication of the text. Secondly, in terms of the establishment of text, these are ahad hadith. They're the hadith about reciting the Fatiha are dhanniyud dilala. They're all probabilistic, not decisive. Number two, they're dhanniyud thubut. They are on their own non-decisive in their establishment. They're sahih hadith, yes, but sahih does not mean qat'i in the usage of the Hanafi. Now we have to distinguish between what the muhaddithin, and some people get confused. They read Sharh al-Nukhba, for example, and what Ibn Hajar says about the hadith al-sahih yufidu al-qat', right? But that's a different usage. That's the usage of the muhaddithin, and that it has its indications, and we can see them where they are. And now, alhamdulillah, we have multiple commentaries on Sharh al-Nukhba by great Hanafis. Amongst them, we've had it for a while. Mullah Ali al-Qari Sharh Nukhbat al-Fikr. Ibn Qutlubugha also has his ta'liqat on the Nukhba, and all the other works of the Hanafis on the subject, right? Anyways, so it's a non-decisive text, right? We understand that to be لنفي الكمال. So he says, وهو لنفي الكمال. It's a negation. This la is لنفي الكمال for what we have mentioned. Right? And لأنه خبر آحاد, because it is a singular transmission, right? It's not, it's يعني ليس متواترا, right? And in our madhab, see, this is the thing. You have to appreciate, in the Shafi'i school, this is evidence. أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول. So Imam Shafi'i says, obey Allah and obey His Messenger. ما أتاكم الرسول فخذوه. So, in that sense, what is established by the Sunnah is like what's established in the Quran. So therefore, the role of the Sunnah in the Shafi'i school is the Sunnah conditions the Quran. The Sunnah explains the Quran. لا نقبل هذا. Because it freaks the Shafi'is out and the Muhaddithin. What? No. We say the Quran is the asl. And the Sunnah is understood in light of the Quran. So yes, the Sunnah details out the Quran, but in light of the Quran. The Quran lays out the framework, right? And it indicates exactly what it indicates. And then the Sunnah fills it out على مرتبة ثبوتها, at the level in which it is established. And there's the distinction between the qatra and the dhann. So therefore, what is established? لا ينسخ the ahad والنص الظني ظني الثبوت and ظني الدلالة لا ينسخ قوله تعالى فاقرأوا ما تيسر. Recite whatever is easy. And ما من صيغ العموم كل ما يدخل تحت القرآنية تحصل يعني يؤدى به المأمور, right? So recite whatever is easy of the Quran. فكل ما يطلق عليه اسم القرآن. So say هو قدر آية. So what do? We don't ignore the nas, right? Of course, sometimes you have to be aware, because some of the texts are written with the audience in mind. Who's the audience when you have to explain your proof? The Shafi'is, right? So it's explained, says, and sometimes to stake your position, you have to show some, not attitude, but you have to stake your claim. So, well, this is kind of what we have to say. Because if you say that, they'll give you a whop. So you go, لا نعمل به. Sometimes they'll say things like that. But what's meant be لا نعمل به, يعني لا نعمل به على أنه الأصل. لا نعمل بظاهره. Right? بل نعمل, what is the أصل في العمل? So we say the أصل in the عمل is the آية right? ونعمل يعني That's لا نعمل به أي لا نعمل لا نبني عملنا بظاهر دلالته. That's what's meant. لا نبني عملنا بظاهر دلالته. Right? So that's what they mean by لا نعمل به أي لا نبني العمل على ظاهر دلالته بل على مرتبته من الثبوت والدلالة, but in accordance with its level of it being established and its level of indication. It's explained also by Tahtawi here, right? Rather, what it indicates, so we say, okay, what is the fard? That's the asl fil amal, right? The fard is, right? So do you see the difference? Imam Shafi'i said, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقْرَأُ مَا تَيَسَّرَ. The Prophet said, لَا صَلَاةَ بِفَاتِحَةٍ. You put the two together. Recite the Fatiha. And then he say, what's difficult about the Fatiha? Right? Right? So Sunnah conditions the Quran. Now, when we go to Usul al-Fiqh, we say, okay, how is that argued and reasoned? That's beyond the scope right now, right? And ultimately, the true معركة الفقهية is في الأصول ليس في الأدلة. So everybody accepts the same evidence, right? It's what do you understand from the evidence that is the place of argument, right? Nobody has a secret hadith in their pocket, right? So this hadith, so we said the foundation, the asl in it, which is the fard, is established by the Quranic verse. قطعي الثبوت قطعي الدلالة ما تيسر. In our madhab, according to Imam Abu Hanifa and his understanding of language, which is what the Hanafi school is built upon, is that the am and the khas are قطعي الدلالة. Both the am, the general text, like ma, and the siyagh al-umum are, and the khas, like ruku' or sujood. The amr, the command is khas. So dilalat al-amr, right, is from the khas as well. And its indication is very clear. ما تيسر, اقرأوا ما تيسر. Right? Then this verse, this hadith comes, it does indicate a command, لا صلاة. Right? إلا بفاتحة الكتاب. This text is dhanni, but it establishes luzum. So what can be affirmed with it, particularly in light of the Quranic verse, is al-wujub, that is required. Right? So we don't say, you don't have to recite no. The Hanafis are, if nothing, they're nuanced, right? Yes, you don't have to recite the Fatiha على وجه الافتراض, but you have to recite it على وجه الوجوب. فوجب العمل به. So it's wajib to act upon. Right? So it's wajib to act upon. بهذا الحديث. Right? And that's why أصول الفقه is so important. والثاني ضم سورة قصيرة أو 3 آيات أو ضم 3 آيات قصار لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ بالحمد لله وسورة في فريضة أو غيرها. Right? Right? There's no... The second fard is to add a short surah or the extent of 3 verses. 3 verses or their extent. قصيرة أو 3 آيات أي قدر 3 آيات. right? Or the extent of 3 verses, right? As mentioned in the Durr and elsewhere. Because of the words of the Prophet ﷺ, there's no prayer for one who does not recite Alhamdulillah, meaning Al-Fatiha, and a surah after it, meaning the extent of a surah, in a fard or in other than a fard, right? And the same thing, this is a negation of wujub, related to wujub. في ركعتين غير متعينتين من الفرض, in two non-specific rak'ahs of the fard, غير الثنائي, in other than in the 2 rak'ah prayer, because there are only 2 rak'ah. So reciting the extent of 3 verses in a surah, or extent of 3 verses in any two non-specific rak'ahs of the fard. Of course, in the 2 rak'ah fard, there are only 2 rak'ahs, so you have to do it in those 2. وفي جميع الثنائي, in all rak'ahs of the 2 rak'ah prayer. ويجب الضم في جميع ركعات الوتر, and it's necessary to add to the Fatiha the extent of 3 verses in all rak'ahs of the witr. لمشابهة السنة, because the witr resembles the sunnah in one sense. وجميع ركعات النفل, and in all rak'ahs of the nafl, right? لما روينا, because of what we have narrated in the previous hadith. لأن كل شفع من النافلة صلاة على حدة, because each 2 cycles of the nafl prayer are a prayer on its own, and there's a kaf that is omitted there. صلاة على حدة أي يشبه يعني كالصلاة على حدة, they are like a prayer on their own, insofar as if you begin a nafl, you intend 4 rak'ahs, 6 rak'ahs, 8 rak'ahs, you can give salams after 2 rak'ahs, right? You have to recite in each set of 2 rak'ahs. If you invalidate your prayer, all that is due, all that you have to make qada of is 2 rak'ahs, right? Not 4, right? If you say if you sat for the first tashahhud, etc. So the whole set of rulings related to that. It's not, you're not praying 2 rak'ahs, 2 prayers. So it is like 2 prayers. It is not actual 2 prayers, which is why you don't give the open. It's not like 2 prayers in other ways. You don't give it's not 2 actual prayers. That's why. Do you give an opening takbir in the beginning? No. Do you give salams after 2 rak'ahs? No. Right? So there's necessarily a kaf omitted there because mafhum. Right? Okay. ويجب تعيين القراءة الواجبة في الأوليين من الفرض لمواظبة سيدنا النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم على القراءة فيها. And it's wajib to specify the recitation that is necessary in the first 2 rak'ahs of the fard, because that was the invariable practice of our Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. ويجب تقديم الفاتحة على قراءة السورة, and it's necessary to recite the Fatiha first before the surah, للمواظبة, because the Prophet inevitably did it. Now, al-muwadhaba on its own is not, that's a big argument. Al-muwadhaba, the Prophet doing something consistently on its own only establishes it being sunnah mu'akkada. But there is muwadhaba plus that takes something to wujub. Right? 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 الوجوب لابد له من معنى زائد على المواظبة, right? And they discussed that in the larger works, but just the Prophet did something consistently, it does not establish on its own it being wajib, unless there are implications of luzum in it. So he said للمواظبة على وجه اللزوم أو المشعرة باللزوم. Right? So that will sort of take one out of that quandary. حتى لو قرأ من السورة ابتداء فتذكر يقرأ الفاتحة ثم يقرأ السورة, such that if one started the rak'ah, like the first rak'ah or the second, reciting a surah, then one remembered that one hadn't recited the Fatiha, then one would recite the Fatiha and then recite the surah afterward. وَيَسْجُدْ لِلسَّهُ, and one would prostrate for forgetfulness. كما لو كرر الفاتحة, just as one would if one repeated the Fatiha. ثم كرر surah, then ثم قرأ السورة, then one recited the surah. Okay. ويجب ضم الأنف أي ما صلب منه, and it's wajib to add the nose, meaning the firm part of the nose. It has to touch the ground. You don't have to feel the bone. Right? Some people say it starts hurting. Said, who said to press hard? Dam is just that it be in contact with the ground. Right? حقيقة وحكما, because if you put it down, it's there. Right? And you don't have to put the bone itself, because then you'd have to cut your nose, right? Like if the skin on top of the bone is there, that's enough. So it typically only excludes just the very tip of the nose, right? Right? So كما لا يخفى, don't get waswasa and things like this. ما صلب منه, and we took the issue of, can you prostrate just on the nose? Right? Some of you haven't submitted your assignment related to those three issues. Have you? Yeah. Why? للمواظبة عليه. Because of it being the inevitable practice of the Prophet ﷺ, على وجه مشعر باللزوم, right? And because of other texts that confirm it. أمرت أن أسجد على سبعة أعظم, I've been commanded to prostrate on 7 limbs, etc., etc., etc. ولا تجوز الصلاة بالاقتصار على الأنف في السجود على الصحيح, and it's not valid to pray just prostrating on your nose in sajda, i.e. without excuse, according to more correct opinion, unless there's an excuse with the forehead. And we took that this is a less strong opinion, but Imam Shumbali chose it out of caution, right? He chose it out of caution, right? And then we look at the issue of this 2 prostrations and the rest of the wajibs. Next, we try to emphasize a number of important points of method here. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Okay, I have to stop here. If there's questions, we can take them next time.